Turkish FM speaks out on sanctioning Russia over Ukraine. Ankara only supports unbacked restrictions, Mevlut Cavusoglu says. Turkey will not be joining unilateral sanctions imposed on Russia by the West over the conflict in Ukraine, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said on Wednesday. Cavusoglu was asked how long Ankara would be able to resist pressure from the US and its allies to put restrictions on Moscow ahead of talks with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov on the sidelines of the G20 foreign ministers meeting in India's capital New Delhi. We don't need to resist anyone, we make our own decisions as a sovereign state. We don't join any unilateral sanctions. We support only those restrictions that are introduced with the backing of the UN, the foreign minister replied, as cited by the media. It's not just about Russia, but we also don't support sanctions against Iran or any other country, Cavusoglu pointed out, adding that no one can put pressure on Turkey. India, which chairs the G20 this year, is hosting the summit of foreign ministers on Wednesday and Thursday. An Indian foreign ministry official told Reuters on Wednesday that New Delhi didn't want the conflict in Ukraine to dominate the discussions at the event, but acknowledged that it would likely be among the top issues on the agenda. The host nation's intention is to continue playing the voice of the global South, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania and raising issues pertinent to the region, the official said. High-ranking Indian diplomat Vinay Kvatra told reporters that questions relating to food, energy, and fertilizer security, and the impact that the conflict has on these economic challenges that we face will be among those to receive due focus in New Delhi. However, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, who is a stalwart supporter of Kiev, insisted that India should use the G20 gathering to make Russia understand that this war has to finish. According to Borrell, the success of the whole meeting will be measured in respect to what we will be able to do on that. An EU source said separately the EU delegation in New Delhi won't support the final statement as a result of the summit if it doesn't include condemnation of Russia's conduct in Ukraine, Reuters reported.
The Great Game in Asia, a new struggle between China, the US and India is unfolding in Nepal. Will Nepal succumb to the US charm offensive and incur China's wrath, as India loses the plot? Washington is bending over backwards to lure the newly formed communist coalition government of Nepal, which came to power at the end of December, away from its two biggest neighbors India and China. Both nations are locked in a great game over the tiny Himalayan nation, which has become collateral in this diplomatic game of football, where the US is trying to make inroads as a third power. US officials scramble. At the beginning of this year, Nepalese diplomats had a lot of work to do. U.S. Undersecretary for State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland visited Kathmandu on January 29 to 30th, with Samantha Power, administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, following a week later, from February 7 to 9. U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs Afreen Akhtar arrived in Kathmandu on February 13, in what was purportedly a low-key affair. Nepalese officials have indicated that the U.S. National Security Council Senior Director for South Asia, Rear Admiral Eileen Laubachar, is also expected to visit Kathmandu. Most recently, Nepal's government barred a visit by CIA Director William J. Burns because the timing of the trip was not seen as so conducive. He was to fly in from Sri Lanka on February 15 for an 18-hour stay in Kathmandu, however the government stated that permission for the visit had to be withheld in light of the upcoming presidential election on March 9. Each of the U.S. officials has their work cut out as they try to ascertain the political mood in Kathmandu. Washington's actions will definitely have an impact on the confrontation between Beijing and New Delhi, which is unfolding in the Himalayas. Nepal sails away from India. Nepal, one of 46 least developed countries, LDCs, in the world, has often leveraged its geostrategic importance to calibrate its equidistant foreign policy as a buffer state sandwiched between the Asian superpowers. Kathmandu has enjoyed historic ties with New Delhi, as the only erstwhile Hindu kingdom in the world, based on the 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship. However, New Delhi's bilateral ties with Kathmandu have worsened over long-standing border disputes and accusations of Big Brother bullying tactics. Nepal is pivoting away from India. Bilateral ties experienced a new chill shortly after the country was devastated by a horrific earthquake in 2015, which claimed over 9,000 lives. The standoff started after New Delhi imposed a punishing 4-month economic blockade, which came into effect a few months after the earthquake. The restrictions followed protests against the country's new constitution by the Madhesis, who are ethnically and socially close to Indians across the border. Their primary grievances were discrimination and lack of acceptance by the Nepalese state, which has always been a preserve of upper caste Hindus. It was thought that the people of the hills looked down upon those from the Terai, or the southern plains of the country. The Madhisis, who comprise about 30% of Nepal's estimated 30 million people, cited certain citizenship measures that they felt would disproportionately affect them because of cross-border marriages with India. India's Nepal policy has largely been seen through the Madhisi prism. But such a myopic neighborhood strategy has often led to escalating tensions between lowlanders and highlanders, who have migrated there in the past decades. In a diplomatic tit-for-tat, Kathmandu ratcheted up tensions by publishing a new map that exacerbated the contentious border disputes in 2020. Kathmandu effectively claimed Kalapani, Limpiyathura, and Lipulek, which is part of India's hill state of Uttarakhand, as part of its sovereign territory. New Delhi took umbrage, dubbing the map artificial and unacceptable. This aggravation proved to be even more painful for India in the context of triangular relations, where China has emerged as the elephant in the room. China checkmates India. China, Nepal's northern neighbor, is cashing in on India's weakening grip over Kathmandu. Beijing has been raining cash on Nepal for massive infrastructure development in the mountainous nation, tackling both inaccessible terrain and an economy which is heavily dependent on remittances and tourism. Beijing has been suggesting to Kathmandu that the Himalayas may not be a barrier for rail-based trade with the rest of Asia or Europe, or even maritime trade through the South China Sea. The landlocked country is now actively considering alternatives to India's sea ports such as Kolkata and Visakhapatnam, eyeing instead China Sea and dry ports such as Tianjin, Shenzhen, Lianyangong, and Zhanjiang Lanzhou, Lhasa, and Zygat, respectively, which will be more accessible once road and rail links are established under Beijing's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. India needs to deepen trade facilitation for Nepal to keep the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, BIMSTEC, relevant as a maritime sub-regional grouping. But that policy move has hit a roadblock, because Beijing has always considered Nepal as the soft underbelly of southern Tibet and has been consistently looking to ramp up its trade engagement with Kathmandu. Data shows that China in 1995 accounted for a negligible 0.7% of Kathmandu's trade and the remaining 99.03% was with India. Almost 3 decades on, the corresponding figure shows that Nepal's trade with India has fallen to around 64%. China has become the new India for Nepal. In 2019, China accounted for around 40% of new foreign direct investments, FDIs, in Nepal, against India's 30%. Besides, from the mid-1990s, the Chinese Communist Party has been pledging $11.65 million per year to Nepal under an economic and technical cooperation program to implement infrastructure development projects. But now Beijing is generously loosening its purse strings for massive infrastructure projects in the country, estimated to amount to $15 billion. An impoverished Nepal has no option but to curry favor with China, even at the risk of becoming another Sri Lanka. Nepal, a flawed democracy. The nation is in the throes of a massive exodus of its youth bulge due to lack of economic opportunities. GDP is around $30 billion and has further dwindled since the COVID-19 pandemic, amid heightened political instability since the abolition of the monarchy in 2008. On average, 3,000 young people leave the country daily either on work or student visas, and most are unlikely to return. Remittances of over $9 billion and around 25% of GDP, and tourism at over $2 billion and an estimated 7% of GDP, are the major revenue sources, besides foreign aid, which tops $2 billion annually. Nepal's tryst with a flawed democracy began in 1990. Following a popular uprising, the country became a constitutional monarchy. There have been 28 prime ministers since 1990 and several of them, including Girija Prasad Koirala, Surya Bahadur Thapa, and now Prachanda, real name Pushpa Kamal Dahal, have occupied the office multiple times in a game of musical chairs. None have completed the 5-year term since 1990. Significantly, New Delhi was caught out by Prachanda becoming PM for a 3rd time, having backed his opponent Dubba to assume office for a record 6th time, after his Nepali Congress party emerged as the largest after federal elections last year. Can New Delhi fix its oversight? India is trying to address its Nepal oversight while China appears to be winning hands down in a new great game. Earlier this month, India's Foreign Secretary Vinay Mohan Quatra and Nepal's Prime Minister Pachandra discussed a raft of bilateral issues, including energy, trade, and connectivity in Kathmandu. Quatra, who had served as Indian envoy to Nepal, is familiar with the country's fickle political landscape. He held wide-ranging talks with a cross-section of Nepal's politicians from various parties during his 2-day visit that concluded on Tuesday. The meetings were held close on the heels of high-level U.S. delegation visits to Nepal. The U.S. gaze. Nepal is also key to the U.S. putting a spanner in the works of China's Belt and Road Initiative. During her recent visit to Nepal, Victoria Nuland was entrusted with political and diplomatic engagement while Samantha Power emphasized economic cooperation and partnership in key areas, where Kathmandu is in dire need of assistance. Afreen Akhtar Strip laid out the contours of troubled regional issues, where India and China are at odds over Beijing's occupation of Tibet in 1959 and its bid to make Kathmandu dance to its tune. The U.S. wants to emerge as a force to reckon with, having looked at Nepal primarily through the prism of aid. However, Washington is shifting gears and trying to win over Kathmandu, which has been showing a more pronounced pro-Beijing tilt, and could further embrace China under Prachanda's dyed-in-the-wool communist ideology. Newland announced that Washington would invest more than $1 billion in clean energy, electrification, and small businesses led by women and underrepresented communities in Nepal over the next 5 years. Power, too, highlighted U.S. largesse, such as a $58.5 million grant to strengthen inclusive democracy and support civil society organizations, and extended an invitation from U.S. President Joe Biden to participate in the Summit for Democracy in March. The visits assume significance because they directly impact US-Nepal relations, including the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, a $500 million grant for infrastructure development, which was endorsed by Kathmandu last year amid intense debate. Subsequent ratification by Nepal's parliament also upset China. Initially, Prachanda, then a key opposition figure, appeared to be in two minds over the MCC, but later backed the initiative. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs Donald Lu had turned up the heat on Kathmandu ahead of the ratification, even threatening to revisit bilateral ties if Nepal reneged on ratifying the MCC, which the Washington sees as its move to counter Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. The U.S. is even more keen to woo Nepal after Kathmandu rejected the State Partnership Program, SPP, an exchange program between the U.S. National Guard and foreign militaries. Amid a changing world order, Kathmandu is a critical jigsaw piece in Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy, which has raised China's hackles. The high-level U.S. visits to Nepal have become routine. However, China is apprehensive that a proactive Washington could be a part of a strategy to destabilize Asia's biggest economy. Interestingly, Tittle was the last Nepalese prime minister to visit the U.S., in 2002. However, despite Prachanda's anticipated trip to Washington, his first official foreign visit will be to India, expected after the election of Nepal's new president and vice president on March 9 and 19, respectively. Fresh turmoil in Nepal's politics. In a clear breach of understanding, Prachanda ditched coalition partner the Communist Party of Nepal, CPN, UML, over its choice of presidential candidate. In a meeting presided over by former Prime Minister KP Oli, the CPN, UML, decided to back party Vice Chairman Subhas Nambang in the upcoming poll. However, Nepal's 8 political parties, including Prachanda's Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center, CPNMC, backed Ramchandra Poodle for the country's top job. Poodle, 78, is favored to succeed incumbent Bidya Devi Bhandari as the next president because of the overwhelming support he is likely to receive from across the 8 parties, the majority of which are backed by New Delhi and eschew Beijing. However, Prachanda's U-turn over the backing of the presidential candidate may lead to the CPN, UML, withdrawing support from the federal government and the ruling coalition after the election. Prachanda, with the deft touch of opportunist politics that has been his hallmark throughout a checkered career, had agreed to restore the NC-led electoral alliance including the CPN, Maoist Center, CPN, Unified Socialist, Socialist Party of Nepal and other fringe parties. Such a coalition would be connected with New Delhi gaining a temporary edge in decision-making as Beijing plots its next move to play kingmaker, while the U.S. haplessly watches from the sidelines. What should Kathmandu do? Can Nepal strike a balance between India and China? Or should it choose a bear hug with the U.S. and incur China's wrath while maintaining cordial ties with India, which is still a lifeline for most of its trade and transit? U.S. Ambassador to Nepal, Dean R. Thompson, laid out a possible roadmap for Kathmandu's foreign policy last month and rejected allegations of U.S. interference in Nepal's internal affairs. Thompson, who assumed tenure last October, said, Nepal should be able to make its own foreign policy decisions, stressing that the country's location has made it geopolitically important. However, he rejected claims that the various political and financial projects are a preamble for the arrival of American troops in Nepal. The envoy also claimed that Washington did not view Kathmandu through New Delhi's lens, to keep Beijing at bay. But the diplomatic assertions must be borne out by how Prachanda has been trying to strike a diplomatic balancing act amid a dwindling state exchequer, political instability, and popular disenchantment with opportunist politicians. For the moment, it appears to be advantageous to India. But in the unfolding great game, China is likely to have the last word as Washington tries to decode the rough and tumble of Nepali politics, where alliances have lost their relevance and cast doubt over a nation's integrity and test of character. Thus, the current state of affairs has been created by rank opportunism by a motley crew of wily politicians with an insatiable hunger to cling to power.
French farmers hope China will boost crucial pork exports. French farmers are hoping China's reopening after it lifted many of its COVID-19 measures will also unlock more trade in pork and beef exports. Exporting to China is crucial for us, François Valli, president of the country's pork federation, the FNP, tells. Otherwise we have trade with Europe, but it is a trade and not an export. Valli was speaking as one of the world's largest agricultural shows, the Paris International Agricultural Show, got underway, with thousands of exhibitors and hundreds of thousands of visitors expected to come through the doors of the Paris Expo Porte de Versailles this week. China, the world's biggest importer of pork, had been due to publish audits of French pork facilities carried out in 2015, which would clear them to enter Chinese markets. It's hoped these long-awaited inspections could hold the key to boosting trade at a time when the appetite for pork and beef products is on the rise. It's been even more pressing in recent years as China's domestic pork production has been hit by outbreaks of African swine fever. Valli is hopeful trade with China can boost an industry which, like others around the world, is suffering the effects of high inflation, an aging workforce and a lack of younger people coming into the industry. He says Chinese importers are interested in parts of the pig that others are not. They ask for ears, for example. When you put pig ears in a French restaurant, I think everyone will look at them but nobody will eat them, he tells. In China, everybody is chasing the pig's ears, they love it. These are cultural differences, but we need them. They allow us to sell more pieces of the animal, instead of throwing it away. Syria urges UN to deter Israeli attacks after deadly missile strike. Syria on Sunday urged the United Nations to take necessary measures to deter Israel's attacks and hold it accountable after a deadly Israeli missile attack on the Syrian capital Damascus. When Syria was trying to heal its wounds, bury its martyrs, and receive condolences, sympathy, and international humanitarian support in the face of the devastating earthquake, the Israelis launched an air aggression targeting civilian-populated neighborhoods. The Syrian Foreign Ministry said in a statement, "There has been no comment from the Israeli authorities on the attack. 5 people, including a soldier, were killed and 15 others wounded by the Israeli missiles launched from the Golan Heights early Sunday," the Syrian army said, adding that many of the wounded are in critical condition. Many residential buildings in Damascus and the city's countryside were damaged, it noted. At least 15 people were killed, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a war monitor. 9 of the victims were Syrians, 2 civilians, 4 soldiers, and 3 military officers. The identities of the other victims remain unknown, the Britain-based watchdog group said. According to local media reports, the missiles hit the upscale neighborhood of Kafar Sousa, the historic citadel of Damascus, and the Al-Mazrah area. The observatory said the target in Kafar Sousa was an Iranian school, adding that the Israeli missile attack also targeted positions of the Iranian militia and the Lebanese Hezbollah group in the Sayyidah Zainab area, as well as a military site in the southern Syrian province of Swayda. The Israeli attack comes as Syria is still coping with the devastating earthquakes that struck the north of the country on February 6. The tremors have killed and injured thousands of people in the war-torn country. China continues to strive for human-nature harmony. Editor's note, 2023 is the first full year for implementing the guiding principles of the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China. Ahead of this year's 2 sessions, China's key annual political meetings, CGTN presents China Marches On, a special series that takes an in-depth look at the country's endeavors in advancing Chinese modernization. Once called the most unfit place for human settlement by the United Nations in the 1970s, Zihego Prefecture in northwest China's Ningxia Autonomous Region is now on the road to ecological poverty alleviation and prosperity. Located on the lowest plateau, Zihego suffered soil erosion as its terrain is dominated by mountains and hills with low vegetation and loose soil. The barren land made it one of the poorest areas in China. However, the prefecture has shaken off all such tags through the government and people's efforts. For over a decade, afforestation, water conservation, and poverty alleviation have been employed to protect the environment, eliminate poverty and vitalize rural areas, said Qi Yongzhen, the area's delegate to the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China, CPC. Thanks to years of afforestation efforts, Gaiwan, a part of the prefecture, is reaping ecological dividends. It posted a cumulative gross forestry output of 2.05 billion yuan, $295 million, and witnessed significant boosts to tourism and beekeeping industries. The development in Zihego represents China's achievements in ecological conservation and green development in recent years. Yang Yu, a special commentator for China Media Group, says that unlike the Western model of development, China strives to avoid the environmental Kuznets curve, a situation where the environment deteriorates till a certain level of income is attained and only after that the money is invested back into the environment. To pursue the modernization of a country whose population ranks first worldwide but per capita resources are far below the global average, ecological protection is always high on the agenda of Chinese President Xi Jinping, who believes that lucid waters and lush mountains are invaluable assets. Xi's report to the 20th CPC National Congress stressed that the Chinese modernization is the modernization of harmony between humanity and nature. Humanity and nature make up a community of life. If we extract from nature without limit or inflict damage on it, we are bound to face its retaliation, reads the report. China is committed to sustainable development and to the principles of prioritizing resource conservation and environmental protection and letting nature restore itself. Zihego has first-hand experience in this area. Excessive reclamation and grazing in the 1970s worsened the locals' livelihood. It's the reforestation efforts that brought them relief. Xiao Jianping returned home to Zihego to develop rural tourism and benefit from local government's program of returning marginal farmland to forests and grasslands. After Xiao's efforts, Longwangba village received 190,000 tourist trips last year, making a per capita net income of 11,200 yuan. Reforestation is just one of the many measures China has taken in recent years to advance ecological civilization and green development. In recent years, China has strengthened eco-environmental conservation and restoration by setting up a new type of protected area (PA) system, drawing up ecological conservation red lines nationwide and pushing for the integrated conservation and systematic restoration of mountains, rivers, forests, farmlands, lakes, grasslands, and deserts. According to the white paper China's Green Development in the New Era, China's PA system takes national parks as the mainstay, supported by nature reserves and supplemented by nature parks. China has already created its first batch of 5 national parks including the Giant Panda National Park. As of the end of 2021, nearly 10,000 PA of various types and levels had been established, covering more than 17% of China's land area, bringing under effective protection 90% of its natural terrestrial ecosystem types and 74% of key state-protected wildlife species. According to the white paper, the Eco-Environmental Conservation Red Lines, ECRLs, which cover exceedingly fragile areas and areas of potentially vital eco-environmental value, are the lifeline of national eco-environmental security. Over 30% of China's land area is now under the protection of ECRLs, according to the white paper. China will continue to pursue a model of sound development featuring improved production, higher living standards and healthy ecosystems to ensure the sustainable development of the Chinese nation, according to the report delivered by Xi at the 20th CPC National Congress. EU nations MPs greenlight joining NATO. Meanwhile, 2 members of the bloc haven't ratified Helsinki's bid yet. The Finnish parliament on Wednesday overwhelmingly voted in favor of joining NATO. The vote was held before Hungary and Turkey had the chance to ratify the Nordic nations' accession to the US-led military bloc. The bill was supported by 184 MPs of the 200-seat parliament, while only 7 voted against it and 1 abstained. 7 others were not present during the vote. Some of the bill's opponents, including the Left Alliance MPs Markus Mustajärvi and Johannes Yrttiaho, expressed their concerns over Finland not setting any conditions for its NATO membership regarding a potential deployment of nuclear weapons to its territory. I consider it to be the biggest problem with NATO membership, that Finland accepts NATO's nuclear weapons policy and at the same time effectively renounces its non-nuclear status, Yrttiaho said during the debate on Tuesday. Finland's foreign and defense ministers then assured the MPs that NATO membership would not change Helsinki's stance on nuclear weapons. I have already stated before that we are not trying to bring them to Finland, and no one is trying to force them here either, Finnish Defense Minister Antti Kaikkonen said. The results of the vote were hailed by Finnish Parliament Speaker Matti Vanhanen, who called it a historic decision comparable to Finland joining the EU in the 1990s. The parliament had also said that NATO membership once again placed Finland